My parents, Margaret and Frank, whispered with their attorney nearby. I overheard them rehearsing their argument about why I shouldn't inherit Grandpa Samuel's $9.5 million. She's just a waitress at Danny's diner, my mother said coldly, completely irresponsible with money. I touched the small recording device hidden in my blazer pocket, thinking about the Harvard law diploma tucked away in my apartment drawer. They had no idea what was coming. The courtroom felt suffocating as I sat behind the defendant's table watching Judge Harrison shuffle through papers with obvious disinterest. My court-appointed advisor, Janet Walsh, seemed fresh out of law school and completely overwhelmed by the complexity of the inheritance dispute. She kept fumbling with her notes and apologizing for her inexperience. "Your Honor," began Douglas Pierce, my parents' attorney, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're here today because we genuinely fear for Doreen's financial future. The deceased Samuel Morrison left his entire estate to his granddaughter in what we believe was a moment of diminished mental capacity." My mother, Margaret, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, performing the role of concerned parent perfectly. She wore her best Sunday dress and had styled her graying hair in soft waves that made her appear vulnerable and motherly. Frank sat beside her in his only suit, the one he wore to funerals and court appearances, nodding solemnly at every word Pierce spoke. "The evidence speaks for itself." Pierce continued pulling out a stack of photographs. "Miss Morrison works as a waitress at a local diner. Her annual income barely reaches $20,000. She lives in a small apartment, drives a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and has never shown any aptitude for financial management." Judge Harrison leaned forward, examining the photos with what appeared to be amusement. The pictures showed me serving coffee cleaning tables and counting tips at the end of long shifts. Someone had been following me for weeks, documenting my every move at work. "Furthermore," Pierce added dramatically, "we have bank statements showing that Miss Morrison has never maintained a savings account with more than $3,000. She has no investments, no retirement planning, and no experience managing anything beyond her weekly grocery budget." My mother stood up when called to testify, her voice shaking with practiced emotion. "Your Honor, I love my daughter dearly, but I've watched her struggle financially for years. She's a sweet girl, but she's never been practical about money. When she was younger, she would spend her entire allowance on books and donate her lunch money to homeless people. She has a good heart, but no business sense whatsoever." The lies flowed so smoothly from her lips that I almost believed them myself. She painted a picture of a naive, well-intentioned young woman who couldn't balance a checkbook, let alone manage millions of dollars. Frank nodded along occasionally, wiping his brow as if the emotional testimony was overwhelming him. "My father-in-law was 87 when he passed," Margaret continued. "We believe his judgment was compromised by age and medication. He'd always been protective of Doreen, perhaps too protective. This inheritance decision was made during his final weeks when he wasn't thinking clearly about the long-term consequences." Pierce presented medical records supposedly showing Grandpa Samuel's declining mental state. The documents claimed he'd been suffering from early-stage dementia and was easily influenced by anyone who showed him kindness. According to their narrative, I had manipulated a sick old man into leaving me his fortune. Janet Walsh tried to object, but her arguments were weak and unprepared. She stammered through legal precedents and fumbled with evidence folders clearly outmatched by Pierce's polished presentation. I wanted to help her to whisper suggestions and corrections, but I forced myself to remain silent and observe. The courtroom was packed with spectators who seemed to be enjoying the drama. I recognized some of my parents' friends and neighbors, people who had known me since childhood, but were now staring at me like I was a criminal. Their whispered comments carried across the room, calling me greedy and ungrateful. Judge Harrison began asking questions about my lifestyle, my work history, and my relationship with my grandfather. Each question was phrased to make me sound incompetent and manipulative. When I tried to explain that working at the diner was a personal choice rather than a financial necessity, he cut me off with visible irritation. "Miss Morrison," he said with barely concealed contempt, Do you honestly believe that someone who earns tips for a living is qualified to manage a $9.5 million estate? This isn't play money we're discussing. This is serious wealth that requires sophisticated financial knowledge and professional management. The moment I had been dreading finally arrived. Judge Harrison looked directly at me and shook his head with obvious amusement. "A waitress managing millions, that's rich," he declared loudly. The entire courtroom erupted in laughter, including the bailiff and court reporter. People pointed at me while they chuckled, treating my future like entertainment. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Pierce slid a thick envelope across the bench to Judge Harrison's clerk, who quickly tucked it into a desk drawer. The exchange was subtle, but I caught it clearly. My parents weren't just lying about my competence, they were bribing court officials to ensure their victory. The laughter continued echoing in my ears as I realized the entire proceeding was rigged against me. This wasn't about justice or Grandpa Samuel's wishes. This was about greed and corruption, and I was the only person in the room who understood what was really happening. During the lunch recess, I followed my parents to a small conference room where they thought they could speak privately. I positioned myself outside the door using my phone to record their conversation while pretending to scroll through messages. "I can't believe this is actually working," Margaret whispered excitedly. Pierce was right about Harrison being cooperative. Did you see how he looked at her? Like she was some kind of charity case? Frank chuckled softly. The best part was when everyone laughed. Made her look even more pathetic. By the time this is over, she'll be lucky if the court lets her keep her tips from the diner. "I still can't believe your father left her everything," Margaret continued bitterly. "After all we did for him, all those years of driving him to doctor appointments, bringing him groceries, pretending to care about his boring war stories, and he gives it all to little Miss Perfect." What I heard next made my stomach turn. Margaret admitted she'd been forging my signature on loan applications for months, using my name to secure credit lines she never intended to repay. She'd obtained my social security number and personal information to create false financial records that made me appear irresponsible with debt. "The gambling debts are getting worse," Frank confessed quietly. "I owe Henderson's crew almost $60,000 now. They're not patient people, Margaret. If we don't get this inheritance money soon, they're going to break my legs or worse." My father had been lying to everyone about his addiction. While my mother played the concerned parent in court, she was actually enabling his destructive behavior by helping him steal from his own daughter. They'd planned this inheritance theft for months, researching legal loopholes and building false evidence to support their case. "Do you think she suspects anything?" Margaret asked nervously. "Are you kidding? She's too trusting for her own good. Always has been. Remember when she was 16 and gave her college fund to that fake cancer charity She Never Learns? She actually believes people are fundamentally good." They discussed how they'd been monitoring my daily routine, hiring a private investigator to document my work schedule and financial habits. The photographs Pierce had shown in court weren't random snapshots. They were part of a coordinated surveillance operation designed to make me appear unsuitable for inheritance. The most disturbing revelation came when Margaret mentioned Grandpa Samuel's final months. "Thank goodness we thought to give him those memory pills," she said quietly. "Made him confused enough that no one questioned his mental capacity until after the will was signed." My hands started shaking as I realized what she was admitting. They hadn't been giving Grandpa Samuel medication to help his memory. They'd been drugging him to make him appear mentally incompetent. While I thought they were caring for him out of love, they were actually poisoning him to steal his money. Frank pulled out a prescription bottle and shook it slightly. "Still have a few pills left." Dr. Crawford was very understanding about prescribing extra doses for the old man's anxiety. Amazing how cooperative doctors become when you mention potential malpractice lawsuits. "Shh," Margaret hissed. "Someone might hear you. The last thing we need is questions about how we obtain those medications. Everything has to look natural and above board." I took photos of the pill bottle through the slightly open door, capturing the prescription label and dosage information. The medication wasn't for anxiety or memory issues. It was a powerful sedative typically used for patients with severe psychiatric disorders. They'd been giving my grandfather drugs that would cause confusion, disorientation, and memory loss. Pierce says the judge should rule in our favor by tomorrow afternoon, Frank continued. Then we can access the accounts immediately. I can pay off Henderson's crew and still have enough left over to buy that boat I've been wanting. Margaret started calculating how they would split the inheritance money, treating my grandfather's life savings like lottery winnings. She wanted to buy a bigger house in a more expensive neighborhood, take extended vacations, and purchase luxury items she'd never been able to afford. Neither of them mentioned using any of the money to actually care for me or honor Grandpa Samuel's memory. The best part is that she'll never know what hit her, Margaret said with genuine satisfaction. By the time this is over, she'll be so humiliated and defeated that she'll probably leave town. We can tell everyone she moved away to start fresh somewhere else. I realized my parents weren't just stealing money. They were planning to destroy my reputation and drive me out of the community where I'd lived my entire life. They wanted to eliminate me, completely erasing any chance I might have to challenge their narrative or seek justice in the future. As I listened to them celebrate my anticipated downfall, I remembered something Grandpa Samuel had told me during his final weeks. Even while affected by whatever drugs they were giving him, he'd managed to pull me aside and whisper, "Be smart, be patient, and document everything. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to watch most carefully." At the time, I'd thought he was having a confused moment brought on by his medication. Now I understood he'd been warning me about exactly this situation. Somehow, even while being drugged and manipulated, he'd seen through my parents' deception and tried to prepare me for what was coming. The recording device in my pocket felt heavier as I captured every word of their conversation. They had no idea they were providing me with evidence that would destroy their case and expose their crimes. While they planned my humiliation, I was building the foundation for their downfall. When they finished discussing their victory celebration plans, I quietly walked back to the courtroom, my mind racing with everything I'd learned. The inheritance battle was more than family greed. It was elder abuse, fraud, and systematic manipulation of the legal system. But now I had proof, and I knew exactly how to use it. After the court session resumed, I noticed Judge Harrison seemed unusually eager to wrap up the proceedings quickly. He kept checking his watch and rushing through procedural requirements as if he had somewhere more important to be. When he called another recess for the day, claiming he needed time to review evidence, I decided to follow him. Judge Harrison left the courthouse through a side exit and drove to Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant on the wealthy side of town. I parked across the street and watched through the restaurant's large windows as he met with Douglas Pierce at a corner table. They sat close together, speaking in hushed tones while sharing an expensive bottle of wine. Using my phone's zoom function, I photographed Pierce sliding a thick manila envelope across the table to Judge Harrison. The judge opened it briefly, counted what appeared to be cash, then tucked the envelope into his briefcase. Their body language was relaxed and familiar, suggesting this wasn't their first such meeting. I managed to get closer by entering the restaurant and requesting a table near theirs. The hostess seated me 2 tables away, close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation while pretending to study my menu. "The Morrison case should be wrapped up tomorrow," Pierce said quietly. "Harrison family is getting impatient, but I assured them the outcome is guaranteed. The girl doesn't stand a chance with Walsh representing her." Judge Harrison chuckled. "Janet Walsh couldn't win a case if the defendant confessed in open court. I specifically requested her for this hearing. She's fresh enough to make mistakes and inexperienced enough not to recognize what's happening. What about the granddaughter? Think she'll cause problems after we rule against her?" "Doubtful. She seems defeated already. Working-class people usually accept authority without question. She'll probably assume the system knows better than she does and walk away quietly." Their conversation revealed a disturbing pattern. Pierce mentioned several other recent inheritance cases where Judge Harrison had ruled against rightful heirs in favor of family members who could afford his services. They discussed the Patterson estate, where an elderly man's nephew had successfully challenged his uncle's will, despite clear evidence of the uncle's sound mental state. The Rodriguez case, where a grandfather's wishes to leave his farm to his granddaughter were overturned in favor of his financially struggling son. The beauty of inheritance law, Judge Harrison explained, is that it's subjective. Mental capacity, family dynamics, financial responsibility. These are all matters of judicial interpretation. Who's to say what the deceased really wanted or whether their judgment was sound? Pierce pulled out a leather notebook and reviewed what appeared to be a client list. The Stevenson family wants to schedule their hearing for next month. The old woman left her house to her home health aide instead of her children. Should be straightforward enough. How much are they offering? $20,000 for a favorable ruling. The house is worth $300,000, so they can afford to be generous. I realized I was witnessing a systematic corruption scheme that had been operating for years. Judge Harrison wasn't just corrupt. He was running a criminal enterprise that specialized in stealing inheritances from rightful heirs. My case wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that had robbed dozens of families across the county. Judge Harrison's phone rang and he answered with obvious annoyance. "What do you mean the FBI is asking questions about which cases specifically?" His face paled as he listened to the caller. "No, don't discuss anything with them. Refer them to the Judicial Conduct Board and claim you're bound by confidentiality rules." Pierce leaned forward anxiously. "What was that about?" "Apparently some federal agents have been reviewing court records and asking questions about unusual inheritance rulings. Someone may have filed a complaint about judicial bias or impropriety. Should we be worried?" Judge Harrison drained his wine glass and signaled for the check. "Not yet. Federal investigations take years, and they need overwhelming evidence to challenge judicial decisions. As long as we keep our meetings private and our paperwork clean, there's no way to prove impropriety." "What about the Morrison girl if she becomes suspicious?" "She's a waitress, Pierce. She doesn't have the education resources or connections to challenge our ruling. Even if she tried to appeal, she'd need lawyers she can't afford and evidence she doesn't have access to. By the time she figured out what happened, the money would be gone and the trail would be cold." As they prepared to leave, Judge Harrison made one final comment that chilled me to the bone. "The key to this business is choosing the right victims. Target people who lack education, social connections, and financial resources to fight back. Working-class families, immigrants, elderly individuals, without strong advocates. They're perfect because they trust the system and don't know how to navigate complex legal challenges." I followed them outside and watched Pierce hand Judge Harrison a second envelope before they parted ways. This exchange happened in the restaurant parking lot, completely in the open, suggesting they felt completely safe from scrutiny or consequences. Driving back to my apartment, I realized the scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about my inheritance or my parents' greed. Judge Harrison and Pierce were running a criminal organization that had been systematically robbing vulnerable families for years. They had perfected a system that appeared legal on the surface, but was designed to steal from people who couldn't defend themselves. I thought about all the families who had lost their rightful inheritances because they trusted the justice system to protect them. How many elderly people had their final wishes ignored? How many grandchildren, nephews, nieces, and chosen heirs had been robbed of their legacies because they couldn't afford expensive lawyers or didn't understand legal procedures? The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. I had evidence that could expose this corruption, but I also had Harvard law training that most victims lacked. If I didn't act, how many more families would be robbed by these criminals who hid behind judicial robes and legal credentials? As I parked outside my building, I noticed a black sedan that had been following me since I left the restaurant. Through my rearview mirror, I saw the driver talking on his phone while photographing my license plate. Pierce and Judge Harrison weren't just corrupt. They were also paranoid and potentially dangerous. They were already taking steps to monitor me and assess whether I posed a threat to their operation. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. Tomorrow, I would return to court pretending to be the defeated, overwhelmed waitress everyone expected me to be. But tonight, I needed to organize my evidence and prepare for a battle that would determine not just my future, but the fate of an entire criminal enterprise that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The next morning, I called in sick to Danny's Diner and drove to the federal building downtown. I'd researched FBI financial crimes units online and learned they had an office specializing in public corruption cases. My Harvard law background had taught me about federal jurisdiction in judicial misconduct cases, but I needed professional guidance to handle evidence properly. Agent Patricia Coleman looked younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp brown eyes and an attitude that suggested she'd seen every type of financial fraud imaginable. She listened carefully as I explained my situation, occasionally taking notes, but mostly focusing on my face as if assessing my credibility. "Miss Morrison, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated criminal enterprise," she said after I finished my initial explanation. "If your allegations are accurate, Judge Harrison and Attorney Pierce aren't just stealing from individual families, they're undermining the entire judicial system." Agent Ryan Matthews joined our meeting, introducing himself as an undercover investigator who specialized in corruption cases. He was tall and athletic with prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished despite being relatively young. His presence suggested the FBI had been taking corruption allegations seriously, even before my complaint. "We've been investigating irregularities in inheritance court for 8 months, Matthews explained. "Several families have filed complaints about suspicious rulings, but we've lacked the insider evidence necessary to build a prosecutable case. Your legal background and direct access to the defendants makes you uniquely qualified to help us gather proof." Special Prosecutor Linda Torres entered the conference room carrying thick case files and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation for weeks. She was a small woman with graying black hair and intense dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance and demeanor. "Ms. Morrison, before we proceed, I need you to understand the serious nature of what we're asking," Torres began. "If you agree to cooperate with our investigation, you'll be operating undercover in a federal criminal case. This means personal risk, potential danger, and the possibility that your family relationships may be permanently damaged." She explained that Judge Harrison and Pierce were likely part of a larger criminal network that included court clerks, other judges, and possibly law enforcement officials. The corruption scheme had been operating for at least 3 years and had stolen an estimated $12 to $15 million from rightful heirs across multiple counties. "Your parents aren't criminal masterminds," Agent Coleman clarified. "They're victims of a recruitment process that targets financially desperate families and offers them a way to steal from their own relatives. Pierce identifies families in crisis, approaches them with inheritance challenges, and provides them with false evidence and corrupt legal services." Matthews showed me surveillance photographs of Pierce meeting with various families in restaurants, coffee shops, and parking lots. The meetings always followed the same pattern. Pierce would approach relatives of recently deceased individuals, claim their loved one's will was invalid or unfair, and offer to help them challenge the inheritance in court for a percentage of the recovered money. The genius of their system, Torres explained, is that they target families who are already in conflict. Your parents were probably approached after your grandfather's death when they were feeling resentful about being excluded from his will. Pierce gave them a rationalization for their greed and a legal framework for acting on it. Agent Coleman pulled out financial records showing how the stolen inheritance money was laundered through various accounts and shell companies. Pierce maintained accounts in 3 different states. Judge Harrison had been making cash deposits that far exceeded his judicial salary, and court clerks had been receiving regular payments disguised as consulting fees. "The scope of this operation is staggering," Matthews continued. We've identified at least 47 cases where inheritance rulings appear suspicious. Elderly individuals who were mentally competent had their wills overturned. Family members with legitimate claims were declared incompetent or unworthy. In every case, the ruling benefited someone who had hired Pierce and appeared before Judge Harrison. They showed me files on other victims, a veteran whose family stole his Purple Heart and military pension, an immigrant grandmother whose children claim she was too confused to leave money to her granddaughter's education, an elderly teacher whose nephew convinced the court she was senile when she donated her house to charity. "Here's what we're proposing," Torres said, leaning forward intently. "You return to court tomorrow wearing recording equipment and continue pretending to be an unprepared, overwhelmed waitress. We need you to document every illegal conversation photograph, any evidence you can access, and help us establish the full scope of the criminal conspiracy." Agent Coleman explained the technical aspects of the undercover operation. I would wear a nearly invisible recording device that could capture conversations from up to 20 feet away. A backup agent would be positioned in the courthouse, posing as a legal observer. If I encountered danger or needed immediate assistance, I could signal for help using a specific phrase. "What happens to my parents?" I asked, dreading the answer. Matthews looked sympathetic but firm. "They're facing federal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. If convicted, they could serve 15 to 20 years in federal prison. However, if they cooperate with our investigation and provide testimony against Pierce and Harrison, we might be able to negotiate reduced sentences." The weight of the decision pressed down on me. Agreeing to cooperate meant destroying my parents' lives and potentially putting myself in danger. Refusing meant allowing a criminal enterprise to continue stealing from vulnerable families across the region. "I need you to understand." Torres emphasized that this investigation will proceed with or without your cooperation. "We have enough evidence to begin making arrests, but your involvement could help us ensure that every victim receives justice and every criminal faces appropriate consequences." Agent Coleman handed me a folder containing victim impact statements from families who had been robbed by the corruption ring. Reading their stories, elderly people dying knowing their wishes would be ignored, grandchildren losing college funds, disabled individuals being declared incompetent by people who wanted to steal their settlements, made my decision clear. "I'll do it," I said quietly. "But I want guarantees that other victims will be compensated and that this corruption ring will be completely dismantled." "You have our word," Torres replied. "This investigation has been our top priority for months. With your help, we can ensure that justice is finally served." As they fitted me with recording equipment and briefed me on legal procedures, I thought about Grandpa Samuel and what he would have wanted. He'd spent his life fighting for justice and protecting vulnerable people. Now I had the opportunity to continue his work by exposing criminals who preyed on grieving families and corrupted the legal system. The next morning, I would return to court pretending to be defeated and unprepared. But this time, I would be armed with federal backing, sophisticated recording equipment, and a clear mission to bring down a criminal enterprise that had been stealing from innocent people for far too long. I arrived at the courthouse early wearing the same conservative blazer that now concealed advanced FBI recording equipment. Agent Matthews sat in the public gallery disguised as a law student, observing court proceedings for a class project. Agent Coleman monitored our communications from a van parked outside, ready to coordinate with backup agents if the situation became dangerous. My parents looked confident and relaxed as they entered the courtroom with Pierce. Margaret had styled her hair in soft curls and wore a floral dress that made her appear maternal and concerned. Frank carried himself with unusual dignity, standing straighter than he had in years, clearly believing his financial problems were about to be solved. Judge Harrison took his seat with obvious satisfaction, barely glancing at the case files before calling the session to order. His demeanor suggested he considered this hearing a mere formality before ruling in favor of my parents and collecting his payment from Pierce. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierce began with theatrical flourish, we are here today to prevent a tragic miscarriage of justice. The deceased Samuel Morrison was a respected member of this community who unfortunately fell victim to manipulation during his final years. He presented enlarged photographs of me working at Danny's Diner serving coffee and cleaning tables. The images were professionally shot and carefully selected to make me appear humble and working class. Pierce had even included pictures of my old Honda Civic parked outside the diner, emphasizing my modest lifestyle. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming, Pierce continued. Miss Morrison has never earned more than $20,000 annually. She has no investment experience, no business education, and no demonstrated ability to manage complex financial portfolios. Allowing her to inherit $9.5 million would be irresponsible and potentially devastating. My mother took the witness stand again, this time with even more dramatic flair. She dabbed at her eyes while describing her fears for my future, painting a picture of a loving parent trying to protect her naive daughter from her own poor judgment. Doreen has always been impractical about money, Margaret testified tearfully. When she was 18, she donated her entire graduation gift money to a homeless shelter instead of saving for college. She's kind-hearted but completely unrealistic about financial responsibility. Frank nodded along from the gallery, occasionally shaking his head sadly, as if contemplating the tragedy of my supposed incompetence. He'd practiced his concerned father routine, well managing to look both loving and disappointed simultaneously. Pierce presented forged medical evaluations, claiming I suffered from financial anxiety disorder and decision-making impairment. The documents appeared legitimate, complete with professional letterhead and doctor signatures, but I recognized them as sophisticated forgeries designed to support their narrative of my incompetence. Furthermore, Pierce announced dramatically, we have testimony from mental health professionals who evaluated Miss Morrison and concluded she lacks the emotional stability necessary for managing substantial wealth. Dr. Emily Santos, a psychiatrist I'd never met, took the witness stand and began describing my supposed psychological evaluation. She claimed I exhibited signs of financial irresponsibility, poor judgment and susceptibility to manipulation by unscrupulous financial advisors. Judge Harrison listened with obvious approval, occasionally asking questions designed to reinforce the testimony against me. When Janet Walsh tried to object to the questionable evidence, he overruled her without explanation, clearly determined to move the proceedings along quickly. Miss Morrison. Judge Harrison addressed me directly. Do you have any evidence to present regarding your qualifications to manage this inheritance? Any certificates, degrees, or professional experience that might demonstrate financial competence? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. Your Honor, I request permission to represent myself in this matter. Pierce looked surprised but not concerned. Your Honor, while Miss Morrison has the right to self-representation, I would argue that her decision to dismiss counsel demonstrates the poor judgment we've been discussing. Agreed, Judge Harrison replied with amusement. Miss Morrison, you may proceed, but I warn you that this court expects professional behavior and proper legal procedures. I walked to the evidence table and pulled out a leather portfolio I'd kept hidden throughout the proceedings. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by presenting my educational credentials. I handed the court clerk my Harvard Law diploma, my bar exam results, and my law review publications. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as he examined the documents. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School 3 years ago, I announced clearly. I've been working at Danny's Diner by choice, not necessity, while building my legal career and gathering evidence about systemic corruption in inheritance proceedings. The courtroom fell silent. My parents stared at me in shock, their faces pale with dawning realization that their carefully planned deception was crumbling. Pierce fumbled with his papers, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. Furthermore, I continued pulling out my recording device. I have audio evidence of criminal conspiracy involving multiple parties in this courtroom. I pressed play and my parents' voices filled the room. Their conversation from the conference room yesterday played clearly through the courtroom speakers, Margaret admitting to forging my signature, Frank confessing his gambling debts, and both of them discussing how they'd been drugging Grandpa Samuel to make him appear mentally incompetent. Margaret gasped audibly and Frank lurched forward as if trying to stop the recording. Pierce shouted objections, but Judge Harrison seemed frozen, staring at the recording device with obvious panic. I also have photographic evidence. I continued displaying pictures of Pierce bribing Judge Harrison at Romano's restaurant. These images show Attorney Pierce providing cash payments to Judge Harrison in exchange for favorable rulings in inheritance cases. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators began shouting and pointing, court clerks whispered urgently among themselves, and my parents sat in stunned silence as their scheme collapsed around them. Judge Harrison attempted to declare a mistrial, but I cut him off. Your Honor, I have additional evidence of systematic corruption involving dozens of inheritance cases over the past 3 years. The FBI has been investigating this criminal enterprise, and this hearing is being recorded as part of a federal investigation. Agent Matthews stood up in the gallery and identified himself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Agent Ryan Matthews with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This courtroom is now considered a federal crime scene. Pierce suddenly grabbed a letter opener from the evidence table and pointed it at me. Everyone stay back. This whole operation dies here or people start getting hurt. FBI agents immediately surrounded Pierce while Agent Coleman's voice crackled through hidden speakers. Federal agents are entering the building. Nobody move. Pierce's face contorted with desperation. You don't understand. This isn't just about money. There are people involved who will kill me if this comes out. Politicians, judges, organized crime families. This corruption goes all the way to the state capitol. As agents restrained Pierce, he began shouting names and details about the larger criminal network. Judge Harrison tried to flee through his chambers, but federal agents were already waiting for him. My parents sat motionless, watching their dreams of wealth evaporate as handcuffs clicked around their wrists. The recording equipment had captured everything: the attempted bribery, the confession to elder abuse, the admission of systematic corruption, and Pierce's desperate revelation about organized crime connections. In less than an hour, I'd transformed from supposedly incompetent waitress to Harvard-educated lawyer who had just brought down a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. As federal agents secured the scene and began reading rights to the arrested conspirators, I looked around the courtroom that had been designed to humiliate and defeat me. Instead, it had become the place where justice finally prevailed, and a corrupt system faced the consequences of its crimes against innocent families. Within hours of the courtroom arrests, federal agents executed coordinated raids across 3 counties. I watched from the FBI field office as Agent Coleman coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies to dismantle what investigators now called the largest judicial corruption scheme in state history. We're executing search warrants on 17 locations simultaneously, Coleman explained as she monitored radio communications. Pierce's law office, Judge Harrison's home, and Chambers court clerk offices, and the homes of 12 families who participated in fraudulent inheritance cases. Computer screens displayed real-time updates from each raid location. Agents discovered filing cabinets full of forged documents, computer hard drives containing victim databases, and safety deposit boxes filled with cash and stolen jewelry from estate settlements. The scope of evidence was overwhelming. Pierce's law office yielded the most damaging materials. Agents found detailed records of every inheritance theft, including photographs of victims' homes, financial statements stolen from probate files, and payment schedules showing how much each corrupt official received for their cooperation. Look at this, Agent Matthews said, pointing to a spreadsheet on Pierce's computer. He's been operating this scheme in 4 different judicial districts. Judge Harrison was just one of 6 corrupt judges on his payroll. The database contained profiles on over 200 potential victims, elderly individuals with substantial estates, families in financial crisis, who could be manipulated into challenging inheritances, and detailed psychological evaluations designed to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Special Prosecutor Torres arrived with a team of federal prosecutors and victim advocates. She immediately began organizing the evidence into coherent cases that could result in maximum sentences for all involved parties. This investigation has uncovered systematic violations of federal racketeering laws. Torres announced to the assembled agents, "We're dealing with organized crime that happened to involve judges and lawyers instead of traditional criminal families." Judge Harrison's arrest had triggered a cascade of revelations. In custody, he immediately began cooperating with federal investigators, revealing the names of other corrupt officials, and providing detailed information about money laundering operations. His cooperation was motivated by genuine fear rather than remorse. Harrison claims he was being blackmailed, Coleman explained to me privately. Pierce had compromising photographs and videos that could have destroyed his career and marriage. He started taking bribes to prevent exposure, then got trapped deeper in the corruption when Pierce demanded larger favors. The blackmail materials were discovered in Pierce's office safe photographs of Judge Harrison, in compromising situations, recorded phone conversations about personal indiscretions, and evidence of financial improprieties dating back 5 years. Pierce had systematically gathered incriminating evidence on multiple officials to ensure their cooperation. My parents were processed at the federal detention center facing charges that could result in decades in prison. Margaret had collapsed during her arrest, overwhelmed by the realization that her greed had destroyed her family and her future. Frank seemed almost relieved, as if the weight of his gambling addiction and criminal behavior had finally become too much to bear. "Your parents are requesting to speak with you," Agent Matthews informed me during the evening briefing. "They're not entitled to a meeting, but if you're interested, we can arrange a supervised conversation." I agreed to see them partly out of curiosity and partly because I needed closure on the relationship that had brought us to this point. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room with federal agents present and recording equipment running. Margaret looked exhausted and defeated, her careful appearance from the courtroom, replaced by the gray jumpsuit and hollow expression of someone who finally understood the consequences of her actions. Frank seemed smaller somehow, as if the arrest had physically diminished him. "Doreen," Margaret began quietly, "I know you'll probably never forgive us, but I need you to understand that we never meant for things to go this far." "When did it start?" I asked, more curious than angry. Frank answered first. "Pierce approached us 2 weeks after your grandfather's funeral, said he'd heard about the will and thought it was unfair that hardworking parents had been excluded in favor of a young person who might squander the inheritance. He made it sound reasonable," Margaret added desperately, "like we were protecting your grandfather's legacy by ensuring the money went to people who would use it responsibly." They described how Pierce had gradually drawn them deeper into the conspiracy. First, he suggested they contest the will based on questions about Grandpa Samuel's mental capacity. Then he provided them with forged medical records and false witness statements. Finally, he introduced them to Judge Harrison and explained how the judicial system could be influenced to achieve the desired outcome. "The gambling debts were real," Frank admitted sadly. "I owe money to people who don't accept bankruptcy as an excuse. Pierce said this inheritance challenge could solve all our problems and give us enough money to start fresh." "What about drugging Grandpa Samuel?" I asked directly. Margaret broke down completely. "Pierce said it would be temporary, just enough to make him appear confused during his final weeks. The doctor assured us the medication wouldn't cause permanent harm. We told ourselves we were helping him avoid the stress of family conflicts." Their rationalization was pathetic, but revealing. Pierce had expertly manipulated their existing resentments and financial fears, providing them with justifications for increasingly serious crimes. They'd convinced themselves they were victims of an unfair inheritance system, rather than criminals stealing from their own family. "The worst part," Frank said quietly, "is that we knew how much you loved him. We saw how you cared for him during his final months, how you read to him and brought him his favorite foods. But we were so focused on the money that we convinced ourselves you were manipulating him." Federal agents interrupted our conversation with updates from the ongoing investigation. Computer forensics had uncovered evidence connecting the corruption scheme to organized crime families in 3 states. Pierce had been laundering stolen inheritance money through casino operations and real estate investments controlled by known criminal organizations. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Agent Coleman explained. "Pierce wasn't just stealing from individual families, he was feeding money into organized crime operations that fund drug trafficking, human trafficking, and political corruption at the state level." The investigation had uncovered connections to the same criminal organization that had been threatening Frank over his gambling debts. Pierce's corruption scheme was partially designed to generate money for crime families who operated illegal gambling operations and loan sharking businesses. As I left the detention center, I realized my family's greed had made them unwitting participants in a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond our personal inheritance dispute. Their willingness to steal from Grandpa Samuel had connected them to dangerous people who viewed theft and violence as routine business practices. The next morning brought more revelations. Agent Torres announced that federal investigators had recovered over $12 million in stolen inheritance money from various accounts and investment properties. The money would be returned to rightful heirs, including families who had lost their inheritances years earlier and never understood they'd been victims of systematic fraud. Computer analysis revealed that my case had been specifically targeted because Grandpa Samuel's estate was large enough to provide substantial payments to all participants in the corruption scheme. Pierce had researched our family dynamics, identified my parents' financial vulnerabilities, and designed a customized approach to recruit them as co-conspirators. "Your grandfather's inheritance included more than just money," Agent Matthews informed me privately. Federal investigators found additional accounts in his name, containing another $4 million plus real estate investments in 3 states. Pierce and his associates never discovered these assets because your grandfather had hidden them specifically to protect them from potential theft. The hidden assets revealed Grandpa Samuel's sophistication and foresight. Even while being drugged and manipulated, he'd managed to protect the majority of his wealth from the criminals who were targeting him. His decision to leave everything to me hadn't been impulsive or confused. It had been a strategic choice made by someone who understood exactly what was happening to him. As federal agents continued their investigation, I began to understand the full scope of what my cooperation had accomplished. The corruption scheme we'd exposed had been stealing from vulnerable families for years, and our evidence had finally given law enforcement the tools necessary to bring the criminals to justice. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Samuel Morrison Legal Center, watching elderly clients receive assistance with estate planning and inheritance protection. The brick building on Main Street had been transformed from an abandoned storefront into a thriving legal practice that specialized in helping vulnerable families navigate complex inheritance laws. The federal trials had concluded with convictions across the board. Judge Harrison received 15 years in federal prison for racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy. Pierce was sentenced to 25 years for operating a criminal enterprise with additional charges for money laundering and extortion. 17 other individuals, including court clerks, corrupt attorneys, and criminal organization members, received sentences ranging from 5 to 18 years. My parents had cooperated fully with federal investigators, providing detailed testimony about how the corruption scheme operated and identifying other victims who had been targeted by Pierce's organization. Their cooperation had earned them reduced sentences of 7 years each, with the possibility of early release if they continued to assist with ongoing investigations. Margaret had enrolled in the prison's accounting program and was teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates. Frank attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times per week and had become a peer counselor for people struggling with addiction. Both of them wrote letters to victims' families expressing genuine remorse and offering to make financial restitution from their limited personal assets. I visited them monthly at the Federal Correctional Facility, gradually rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty and accountability. The conversations were difficult, but healing, allowing us to address decades of resentment and misunderstanding that had made them vulnerable to Pierce's manipulation. I understand now that we were jealous of your education and your relationship with Grandpa Samuel, Margaret admitted during one of our meetings. Instead of being proud of your accomplishments, we felt diminished by them. Pierce exploited those feelings and convinced us we deserved compensation for our imagined sacrifices. Frank had developed remarkable insight into his gambling addiction and its impact on our family dynamics. I was so ashamed of my debts that I couldn't think clearly about right and wrong, he explained. When Pierce offered me a way to solve my financial problems, I ignored all the warning signs because I was desperate to escape the consequences of my choices. The Samuel Morrison Legal Center had recovered over $14 million for victims of the inheritance fraud scheme. Rose Patterson, the retired federal prosecutor who had befriended me at Danny's Diner, had joined the practice as senior counsel and was leading a class-action lawsuit against the criminal organization that had profited from the stolen money. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud, Rose told me as we reviewed case files from victims seeking assistance. He spent his career fighting corruption as an FBI agent, and now you're continuing his mission by helping families protect their legacies from criminals. The revelation about Grandpa Samuel's FBI background had emerged during the federal investigation. His personnel file revealed 30 years of service, investigating organized crime and public corruption. His decision to hide assets and leave detailed records about the corruption scheme wasn't confused behavior. It was the final operation of a career law enforcement officer who recognized the threat targeting his family. Danny Morrison had become an unofficial community organizer, using his diner as a meeting place for families affected by inheritance fraud. Every Thursday evening, the back room hosted support group meetings for people who had lost money to various scams and financial crimes. The gatherings provided emotional support and practical assistance with legal procedures. Tommy Burke, the courthouse janitor who had provided crucial surveillance evidence, had enrolled in law school with scholarship funding from the Victim Compensation Fund. He was studying criminal justice and planned to join the FBI after graduation, inspired by his role in exposing the corruption scheme. Jake Morrison, Danny's nephew, and the police detective who had assisted with background checks now headed the county's new financial crimes task force. The unit specialized in identifying and investigating inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and judicial corruption before victims could be harmed. The most satisfying part of this work, Jake explained during a community meeting at the diner, is preventing crimes instead of just investigating them after the damage is done. We've developed early warning systems that identify vulnerable families and suspicious legal activities before criminals can complete their schemes. My romantic relationship with Agent Matthews had developed slowly and naturally over the months following the investigation. Ryan had been reassigned to the Regional Organized Crime Task Force, but remained involved in ongoing prosecutions related to the inheritance fraud case. Our shared commitment to justice and victim advocacy had created a strong foundation for our personal relationship. What I admire most about you, Ryan told me during one of our evening walks through downtown, is that you transformed personal betrayal into systemic change. Instead of just seeking revenge against your parents, you've created something that will protect other families for years to come. The Legal Center had processed over 200 cases in its first 6 months, recovering millions of dollars for elderly clients, disabled veterans, and immigrant families who had been targeted by various inheritance scams. Each successful case felt like a tribute to Grandpa Samuel's memory and validation of his faith in my ability to continue his work. Legislative reforms had emerged from the federal investigation. The state passed new laws requiring recorded proceedings in all inheritance hearings, mandatory ethics training for judges, handling estate matters, and stronger penalties for elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The reforms were being studied by other states as a model for preventing judicial corruption. Professional recognition had followed from my work exposing the corruption scheme. Harvard Law School invited me to speak about public interest law and judicial ethics. The American Bar Association presented me with their Young Lawyer Public Service Award. Local newspapers wrote feature stories about the transformation from waitress to corruption-fighting attorney. But the most meaningful recognition came from the families we'd helped. Mrs. Chen, whose grandchildren had nearly lost their college fund to inheritance fraud, sent handwritten thank you cards every month. The Patterson family, whose farm had been restored after successful litigation, named their new horse Samuel in honor of my grandfather. The Rodriguez family invited me to their annual reunion, treating me like an honorary family member. The victim support group had evolved into a broader community advocacy organization that addressed various forms of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Volunteers provided transportation to legal appointments, assistance with paperwork, and emotional support during court proceedings. The program had become a model for other communities dealing with similar problems. The most important lesson from this experience, I told a gathering of law students who visited the center, is that individual courage can create institutional change when it's supported by community engagement and professional expertise. One person with evidence and determination can expose corruption that affects hundreds of families. Working at Danny's Diner one day per week had become an essential part of my routine. The diner served as an informal legal clinic where community members could discuss problems and receive preliminary advice about their rights. Many of my most important cases had originated from conversations with customers who trusted me because they'd seen me serving coffee and clearing tables. "You haven't forgotten where you came from," Danny Morrison observed as I helped with the lunch rush. "Success could have changed you, but you're still the same person who cares about everybody who walks through that door." The inheritance money had been fully restored with additional compensation for the emotional distress and legal expenses caused by my parents' fraud. I'd used most of the funds to establish the legal center, create the victim compensation program, and endow scholarships for students from working-class families who wanted to pursue legal careers focused on public service. Living modestly in the same small apartment and driving the same reliable Honda Civic kept me connected to the community I served. The visible symbols of wealth, expensive cars, luxury housing, designer clothing, would have created barriers between me and the clients who needed my help most. Real wealth. Grandpa Samuel had often said, comes from using your resources to help other people achieve their dreams and protect their families. His words guided my decisions about how to manage the inheritance and structure my legal practice. The federal investigation had expanded beyond our local corruption scheme to expose similar operations in 12 other states. Pierce's criminal organization had been part of a national network that specialized in inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and judicial manipulation. Our evidence had provided the foundation for prosecutions that ultimately recovered over $60 million for victims across the country. Visiting my parents had become an opportunity for genuine family conversations that we'd never experienced during my childhood. Without the pressure of financial stress and social pretensions, we'd been able to discuss our fears, dreams, and regrets honestly for the first time. I realize now that we raised you to be successful, but never celebrated your accomplishments. Margaret reflected during one of our recent visits. We were so focused on what we lacked that we couldn't appreciate what you had achieved through your own hard work. Frank had developed a deep understanding of how his addiction had affected our family relationships. Gambling wasn't just about money, he explained. It was about escaping feelings of inadequacy and disappointment that I never knew how to address honestly. Crime seemed like a solution, but it only made everything worse. Their transformation had been genuine and inspiring, demonstrating that even people who make terrible choices can learn from their mistakes and contribute positively to their communities. Margaret's financial literacy classes had helped dozens of inmates develop better money management skills. Frank's addiction counseling had prevented several people from making decisions that could have destroyed their lives. The legal center was expanding its services to include immigration law, disability advocacy, and criminal defense for people who couldn't afford private attorneys. Rose Patterson had recruited 2 young lawyers who shared our commitment to accessible legal services and social justice advocacy. What we're building here, Rose explained as we plan the expansion, is a model for legal practice that prioritizes community needs over profit maximization. Every successful case generates revenue that supports pro bono services for people who can't pay. Community partnerships had strengthened our impact significantly. The local medical center provided free health screenings for elderly clients. The community college offered financial literacy classes taught by volunteers from the legal center. Churches and social service organizations referred families who needed legal assistance but didn't know how to access it. As I stood in the legal center that evening, reviewing case files and preparing for the next day's client meetings, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been a Harvard Law graduate hiding my education while working as a waitress and gathering evidence about family corruption. Now I was running a legal practice that had become a regional model for community advocacy and victim services. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been moments of doubt, fear, and overwhelming responsibility that made me question whether I was capable of handling the challenges I'd taken on. But each successful case, each family reunion, each corrupt official sent to prison had reinforced my commitment to continuing Grandpa Samuel's work. The evening news was broadcasting a feature story about legislative reforms inspired by our corruption investigation. Elderly advocates across the state were using our case as an example of why stronger protection was needed for vulnerable families dealing with inheritance disputes. My phone buzzed with a text message from a new client whose family was being pressured to contest their grandmother's will. "Can you help us? We heard about your work and think something similar might be happening to us." I smiled as I typed my response. "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring all your documents and let's make sure your grandmother's wishes are protected." The work was far from finished. Corruption, elder abuse, and inheritance fraud continued to threaten vulnerable families across the country. But we'd proven that ordinary people with legal knowledge, community support, and moral courage could challenge powerful criminal organizations and win. Before leaving the office, I called the victim support group to check on Mrs. Patterson, whose family had recently completed their inheritance case. Her granddaughter was starting college in the fall, funded by the trust that had been nearly stolen by corrupt relatives and their criminal associates. "How do you feel about everything that's happened this year?" Mrs. Patterson asked me during our conversation. I thought about her question as I locked up the legal center and walked to my car. The journey had been painful, surprising, and ultimately transformative. I'd lost my illusions about my parents, but gained a deeper understanding of how good people can make terrible choices when they're desperate or manipulated. I discovered that corruption can hide behind legal procedures and respectable appearances, but it can also be exposed and defeated by people who refuse to accept injustice quietly. "I feel grateful," I finally answered. Grateful for the education that prepared me to fight back, grateful for the community that supported me, and grateful for the opportunity to continue work that makes a real difference in people's lives. Have you ever had to choose between protecting family members and seeking justice? What would you do if you discovered that people you trusted had been lying to you for years? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please like this video if you believe that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to give up on what's right. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. And please share this story with anyone who needs to remember that corruption can be defeated when good people work together. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I hope you'll continue to believe in the possibility of justice even when it seems impossible.